I'll never forget the night I found myself stuck in a gas station out in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't just the isolation that made my skin crawl, but the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though there was no one else there. It was around 2 a.m. when I pulled in after a long stretch of driving through the desolate highway with nothing but the endless stretch of darkness around me. I'd been driving for hours, and the only light was the flickering street lamp above the pump. The station itself was small, old, and worn out, the kind of place you might expect to find in a ghost story. I pulled my car into one of the spots near the pump, the only car in sight. The silence of the night was eerie, even though it was a gas station. The faint hum of the neon sign and the rattle of the gas pump were the only noises breaking the stillness. I stepped out of my car and noticed how cold the air felt, even though it was the middle of summer. The wind had died down, but there was an underlying chill that set me on edge. I could see the store through the glass windows of the station, but the lights inside were dim, and no one seemed to be moving around. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should just get back in my car and drive off, but I needed gas, and I didn't know when the next station would be. I walked towards the door, feeling like something was wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. As I entered the gas station store, I immediately noticed the musty smell of old cigarettes and stale coffee. The place was old, and it looked as if it hadn't been properly cleaned in years. The linoleum floors were chipped and scuffed, and the aisles were stacked with dusty cans and forgotten snacks. There was no one at the counter, but I could hear soft, shuffling footsteps from the back room. I stood there for a few seconds, waiting, but no one came out. I called out, "Hello?" but my voice sounded small and weak in the vast emptiness of the station. I wandered toward the counter, thinking the attendant might have stepped out for a second. There was no bell, so I tapped my fingers on the counter and waited, still feeling like I was being watched. Just as I was about to call out again, the door to the back room opened with a loud creak. A man stepped out. He was tall, with disheveled hair, pale skin, and a strange, blank look on his face. He was wearing a faded old gas station uniform that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat and distant. I nodded, trying to ignore the unease building in my stomach. "Yeah, I just need to pay for gas." The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me. It was like he wasn't fully present, his gaze unfocused, like he was seeing something far beyond me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something unsettling about him. I walked up to the counter and placed my payment on the surface, trying to make small talk to distract myself. "So, how late do you usually stay open?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He didn't answer at first. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he whispered, "Until they leave." I blinked. "Until who leaves?" "Them," he said, his voice barely audible. He seemed to be looking at something over my shoulder. I turned around quickly, but the store was empty, nothing but shadows. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, that something was watching me. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. The man didn't respond. He just turned slowly and walked back into the back room, disappearing behind the door. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I should leave, but I had already paid, and the gas pump was outside. I had to finish what I came for. So, with my heart pounding in my chest, I walked back out into the night, feeling more nervous than I had when I first arrived. I went to my car and began to pump gas. The sound of the fuel splashing into my tank was the only thing that broke the silence. As I stood there, waiting for the pump to click off, I noticed something strange. The lights around the gas station flickered, almost as if they were being dimmed on purpose. A cold wind picked up, rattling the leaves on the ground. I shivered. Then I heard it, a soft whisper. It came from behind me. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. The whispering sounded like it was coming from inside the station, from the darkened windows where no one was supposed to be. The voice was faint, almost indecipherable, but I could swear I heard the words, "Leave, now." My blood ran cold. I quickly finished fueling, not caring if the pump clicked or not. My hand fumbled with the nozzle as I quickly yanked it out of my car, throwing it back into the pump. I didn't care if I broke the machine. I was about to leave. I was almost out of there when I saw something that made my blood run colder than I thought possible. The man from inside the station was standing outside just a few feet from the door, staring at me. His eyes were wide, his mouth twisted into a strange, almost skeletal grin. But it wasn't just the look on his face that terrified me. It was what was behind him. In the shadows of the gas station, I saw shapes, figures, slowly creeping toward the door. They weren't human. They weren't even close. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like they were gliding, not walking. The shadows were long, distorted like they didn't belong in the real world. The man's voice was low, almost a growl. "You're too late," he said. "They're already here." My pulse shot through the roof. I turned and bolted toward my car, heart hammering in my chest. I jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it, frantically starting the engine. My hands were shaking as I put the car in drive and peeled out of there, not looking back for even a second. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the gas station fading into the distance. But instead, I saw the figures in the shadows again, standing at the pumps watching me leave. That's when I heard it, a sound I'll never forget for the rest of my life. Laughter, soft, mocking laughter. But it wasn't human. It was deep, like a growl, distant, yet all around me. It filled my ears, vibrating through the car. It was like they were mocking me, knowing that I couldn't escape them. I could feel their presence around me, closing in like I was being followed. My eyes darted to every side mirror, convinced I was being chased. And then, as if by some twisted fate, I saw the sign for the next town. I didn't know how far I was from it, but I knew that place was a nightmare. As I crossed into the more populated area, the laughter slowly faded, but I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. When I finally reached my destination, I found a safe, well-lit hotel to check in, locking the door behind me. That night, I lay awake in my bed, the fear still clinging to me. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the gas station. The way the man looked at me, the figures and the laughter, it wasn't right. And now, every time I pass a gas station late at night, I wonder if they're still there, waiting for the next lost soul to drive in. I know I'll never go back. No one should.
Next story.
It was one of those nights where everything seemed off. The kind of night where you know something is wrong but can't put your finger on it. I had been driving for hours, heading home after a long business trip. The road was desolate, with only the occasional passing car, and the sky had already been swallowed by darkness. My eyes were tired and my stomach was starting to growl, but I wasn't anywhere near any decent food. That's when I spotted it, the gas station in the middle of nowhere. It was dimly lit and had that eerie, old-school feel to it, with a cracked neon sign flickering above the entrance. I figured I'd stop for a snack and fill up the tank. I pulled into the lot, the crunch of gravel under my tires louder than it should have been. As soon as I stepped out of the car, a cold breeze hit my face, even though it wasn't that chilly outside. I shook it off and headed inside. The door creaked and I winced at the sound. The interior was just as dated as the outside, with faded, yellowed signs and shelves stocked with candy and chips. Behind the counter, a man was standing there, his back to me. He didn't turn around when I entered, and I assumed he hadn't heard me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the silence. The man turned slowly, his face pale and worn. His eyes were hollow, and there was something unsettling about the way he looked at me. He didn't smile or greet me. Instead, he just nodded and then turned his attention to the register without saying a word. The silence was oppressive, and it felt like the air in the store was thicker than it should have been. I walked over to the snack aisle and grabbed a bag of chips and a soda, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease. I didn't know why, but it felt like the place was holding its breath. Something about the gas station was wrong. I kept looking over my shoulder as if I was expecting someone to be standing there, but no one was. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, and the ticking of an old clock was the only other sound in the building. After a few minutes, I decided I'd had enough. I headed back to the counter and put the items down. The man rang them up without saying anything, and when I handed him cash, he didn't make eye contact. He just took the money and dropped the change in my hand. That's when I heard it, a low thud. It came from somewhere deeper in the building, like something heavy falling to the floor. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The man didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't even seem to acknowledge the sound. My heart began to race, and I felt the overwhelming urge to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. "What was that?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice trembled slightly. The man's face didn't change. He simply shrugged and muttered, "Probably nothing." I stood there for a moment, staring at him, trying to make sense of what I was feeling. My instincts were screaming at me to get out, but I didn't know why. I turned to leave, but as I did, I noticed something strange. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing in the far corner of the store. It was shadowy and unclear, but there was a presence there. Something that shouldn't have been. My breath caught in my throat, and my feet seemed to move of their own accord. I turned back to the man. "Who's back there?" I asked, but the words felt weak, like I was too afraid to even speak properly. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward the corner where the shadow was. I followed his gaze, and for a moment I swear I saw it move. The figure seemed to shift, like it was aware of me, but I couldn't make out any details. It was like a distorted silhouette, tall, thin, and standing unnaturally still. My body froze. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Suddenly, the figure took a step forward, and then another. I bolted. I didn't look back. I didn't stop to grab my things. I just ran for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I fumbled with the handle, I heard the man's voice, barely audible. "Don't go out there." I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't care. The door swung open, and I rushed outside, gasping for air. The night felt colder than before, and the wind whipped around me, making me shiver. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man standing in the doorway, watching me. But the door was shut, and the gas station was silent. I didn't waste any time. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced at the gas station in the rearview mirror. The lights were flickering again, but this time something was different. The shadowy figure, now more defined, was standing outside, just beyond the light's reach, staring at me. Its eyes glowed faintly, but the rest of its face was obscured by the darkness. My blood ran cold, and I slammed on the gas. I drove for what felt like hours, not daring to look back, but every time I glanced at the mirror, I saw that same figure trailing behind me. It was like it was following me, its presence growing closer with every passing mile. I don't know how, but I knew it was real. That gas station, that man, they weren't just part of some bad dream. They were part of something much darker. Eventually, I made it to the nearest town, and I stopped at a diner to gather my thoughts. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread, but it clung to me like a thick fog. I told the waitress what had happened, though I could tell by her expression that she didn't believe me. But then she said something that chilled me to the bone. "Oh, you were at that gas station, huh?" she said, her voice low. "A lot of people don't make it out of there. It's been abandoned for years, you know? The owners disappeared without a trace, and no one's been able to figure out what happened to them. People still say they see things out there, hear things in the night. Some folks swear there's something that's not quite human living there now." My stomach churned. I felt like I might pass out, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to know more. "But the man, the one at the counter," I stammered. She just shook her head. "No one's been inside that place for a long time. You must have seen something else. Maybe a ghost. Maybe something worse. People around here call it the Watcher, but no one knows what it really is. Just don't go back there, okay? It's not a place you want to mess with." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring at me. And every time I opened my eyes, I half expected to see that figure standing at the foot of my bed. I never went back to that gas station, and I never will. But sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I still feel like I'm being followed. And sometimes, if I'm quiet enough, I can hear a low thud in the distance. It's faint, but it's there. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I know one thing for sure. Some places should never be visited. And that gas station, it's one of them.
Next story.
It was a late October evening when I found myself on a lonely stretch of highway, tired and desperate for a place to rest. I had been driving for hours through small towns that barely registered on the map, and the constant hum of the tires on the road had started to lull me into a trance. It was the kind of night where the moon hung low, obscured by dark clouds, casting everything in a gloomy, ethereal glow. I hadn't planned to stop, but as I drove, I noticed a small, faded sign by the side of the road. It read, "Open 24 hours, Old Willow Inn." A gas station and diner, it seemed, both in one place. I figured I could stretch my legs, grab a coffee, and maybe use the bathroom before continuing my journey. The moment I pulled into the lot, I could sense that something was different about this place. It wasn't just the isolation that was to be expected on roads like this. It was the silence. I didn't hear the usual hum of a neon sign buzzing or the faint chatter of customers inside. The entire parking lot was empty. The diner's windows were dark, and the gas pumps looked like they hadn't been used in days. Still, the lights were on in the diner, and the sign flickered as if it was beckoning me inside. As I stepped out of my car, I noticed a chill in the air. It wasn't a cold night by any means, but there was an unmistakable crispness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The gravel beneath my boots crunched loudly as I walked toward the diner's entrance. I pushed open the door, and the bell above it rang faintly. The interior was dim, lit by a few flickering overhead lights. A couple of old-fashioned booths lined one side of the room, their seats cracked and worn from years of use. The counter was empty, except for a single figure sitting at the far end, hunched over a cup of coffee. The figure was an older man with a long gray beard and tattered clothes that looked like they belonged to another time. He didn't seem to notice me as I entered, but his eyes were fixed on the mug in front of him, almost as if he was waiting for something. Behind the counter stood a woman, young and pretty, but with an air of unease about her. She wore a faded waitress uniform, but her movements were stiff, robotic, like she was simply going through the motions. She didn't greet me as I walked in, but she looked up and gave me a tight, almost forced smile. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice hollow, as if she had said the same words 1,000 times before. I hesitated. "Just a coffee, I guess." She nodded and moved toward the coffee pot without saying anything more. As I sat down at one of the booths, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The place was empty. No other customers, no staff moving around in the back. Just the man at the counter, the waitress, and me. Yet the lights were on, and everything seemed operational, despite the strange lack of life. I glanced around, trying to distract myself. On the wall behind the counter was an old, yellowed map of the area, and next to it, a bulletin board covered with various flyers. One flyer in particular caught my attention. It was old and faded, the edges curling up. It was an advertisement for a greatly reduced rate on rooms at the inn, but something about it seemed odd. The date on it was from 1981. I was about to ask the waitress about it when the old man at the counter suddenly spoke, his voice gravelly and dry. "You've come a long way to find this place," he said, his eyes still fixed on his coffee. It wasn't a question, more of an observation. I froze. How could he know that? I hadn't mentioned where I was going, and I certainly hadn't told him how far I had driven. But there was something in his tone, something ancient, that made me feel as though he had seen me before, or perhaps had been expecting me. I managed to force out a response. "I'm just passing through. What's this place?" The man let out a soft chuckle, but it wasn't a pleasant one. "It's a place for travelers, all right," he said, his voice taking on a sinister edge. "But it's not the kind of place you just pass through." At that moment, the waitress set my coffee down in front of me. I took a sip, but I could barely taste it over the rising sense of dread that was creeping into my chest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the strange atmosphere around me. "You don't understand, do you?" the old man continued, his voice now almost a whisper. "This place doesn't let people leave once they've come." I felt my stomach drop. What was he talking about? Was he talking about the diner? The gas station? Or something else entirely? I glanced at the waitress, hoping she could offer some explanation, but she had her eyes cast down, focusing on the counter, almost as though she were avoiding eye contact. "What do you mean?" I managed to stammer. The man turned his head slowly toward me, his pale eyes locking onto mine. "You'll see soon enough. The road keeps bringing people here, and no one leaves." I could feel the blood drain from my face. His words didn't make any sense, yet somehow I knew he wasn't lying. There was something about the way he said it, a kind of certainty that sent an icy chill through me. Suddenly the lights above flickered, and I heard the faint sound of a car pulling into the lot outside. I turned toward the window, expecting to see another vehicle pulling in for gas or food, but when I looked out, there was nothing. Just the empty road and the same dark sky. "Don't look out the window," the old man warned, his voice sharp now. "It's already started." Before I could ask what he meant, the door to the diner swung open. A young couple walked in, looking tired but friendly. They waved at me as they sat at the booth across from me. The waitress greeted them, offering them the same mechanical smile she had given me. I watched them carefully, trying to gauge if they had noticed anything strange. They didn't seem to. The couple chatted with the waitress as if everything were normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It was as though the moment they walked in, the air itself had shifted. Heavier, darker. And then I saw it. In the reflection of the window behind the young couple, I saw something, or someone, standing in the parking lot. It was a figure, tall and gaunt, dressed in tattered clothing. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive. It was standing still, watching the diner with an unnerving stillness. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I glanced back at the couple, but they didn't seem to notice. The waitress, too, seemed oblivious, going about her work without a care in the world. But I couldn't look away. The figure outside was growing closer, moving slowly toward the door. The old man's voice cut through my thoughts. "It's too late for you, too." I didn't even bother finishing my coffee. I stood up, my legs trembling, and bolted for the door. As I reached for the handle, I glanced one last time at the couple. They were still talking, smiling, completely unaware of the figure creeping up behind them. I burst out into the cold night air and ran to my car. I didn't even check the parking lot. I just started the engine, threw it in gear, and sped off down the road, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. The last thing I remember before I left the place behind was seeing the figure in the rearview mirror, standing at the window of the diner, staring out at me. And then the road was empty again. I haven't been able to find that diner again, no matter how many times I've tried. The road just keeps changing, twisting, and leading me in circles. And every time I pass that spot where it should be, there's nothing. No sign, no lights, just an empty stretch of highway. But every now and then, when I'm driving late at night, I still hear the faint echo of a bell ringing as if someone is calling me back.
Next story.
I've never been the type of person to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. I'm a practical person, always looking for logical explanations. But what happened to me that night at that gas station, it changed everything. I'll never look at a gas station the same way again. It was late, really late. I was driving back home from a business trip, miles away from my hometown. I hadn't planned to stop, but my car was running low on gas and there was a small station up ahead. I could see the lights from a distance, and honestly, I was just relieved to see any sign of life at that hour. I pulled in, and the place seemed off. It wasn't run down or anything, but there was something about it. Maybe it was the flickering overhead lights or the eerie silence that surrounded it. The station was isolated, sitting at the edge of a stretch of highway with nothing else in sight for miles. The small convenience store was dark except for a faint light inside, and the gas pumps were positioned like they were waiting for someone. I parked by the pump closest to the door, the kind of pump that's usually reserved for the last customer of the night. When I stepped out of my car, the cold night air hit me like a slap to the face. I walked over to the pump, checked my wallet, and started to fill up. That's when I heard it. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A soft sound like a slow scraping noise. I glanced around, trying to figure out where it was coming from. There was no one else there, at least no one visible. The station was empty and the wind had died down. It was just this noise. At first, I thought it might be the metal on the pump. Maybe it was malfunctioning, making that sound as the gas flowed. But then I looked up, and that's when I saw something strange. A shadow. No, it was more like a figure was standing by the door of the store. It was vague at first, like a silhouette, but as my eyes adjusted, I could make out the outline of a person. I froze. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me. At least I think it was staring at me. It was so dark that I couldn't see details, but I could feel it, like the air had thickened. My heart started to race, and the scraping sound came again, but louder now. It was coming from behind me. I spun around quickly, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. There was nothing there. No strange wind, no malfunctioning pump, just silence. I turned back to the store, but the figure was gone. In its place, the door to the convenience store was slowly creaking open. A chill ran down my spine. I thought about getting back into my car and driving off, but I couldn't. Something about the situation held me there, like an invisible force. The door to the store was fully open now, and inside I saw the faint glow of a light above the counter. But no one was behind it. The place seemed empty, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I took a step toward the store, then another. My feet moved on their own, like they were being controlled by something beyond my will. I walked slowly, cautiously, trying to keep my thoughts straight. I reached the door, and as I went to step inside, I heard something. It was a voice, but not one I recognized. It sounded distant, hollow, like it was echoing from far away. "Come inside." I froze again. The voice wasn't just in my ears, it was in my head. A whisper, soft and beckoning. I glanced around the station, still empty. But the air felt different now, heavier. The world seemed to be holding its breath. I could feel something was wrong, but I still couldn't move. My legs carried me into the store without my permission. The interior was dimly lit, and the air inside smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. Shelves were stocked with dusty bottles of soda and old snack foods. The floor was coated in a thin layer of grime. The place was run down, but that wasn't what disturbed me. It was the feeling that something was waiting. I walked past the aisles, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of life. There was a bell on the counter that jingled as I approached. Still, no one appeared. But the silence was oppressive now, louder than any noise could have been. Then, I saw something at the back of the store. A door, cracked slightly open. It led to a room I couldn't see into. The scraping noise came again, but this time it was coming from beyond that door. I don't know why I walked toward it, but I did. Each step felt like I was moving in slow motion, like the air was thick with something sinister. The door creaked when I pushed it open. It was dark inside, but I could make out the outlines of something. Something that wasn't right. A figure, no, several figures stood huddled in the corner. They were hunched, their faces hidden by shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me. I stepped backward, but my feet wouldn't obey. I was trapped. The figures slowly turned toward me, and as they did, the light flickered on overhead. And that's when I saw them. Their faces, they weren't faces at all. They were just distorted, like something had happened to them, something unnatural. "Why are you here?" one of them rasped. The voice wasn't human. It was hollow, like an echo from a place that didn't exist. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The air was too thick. It pressed in on me from all sides, squeezing my lungs. I felt like I couldn't breathe. "We've been waiting," the figure continued. "Waiting for someone to come." I took a step back, then another. I had to get out of there. My body finally responded, and I turned to run, but as I reached the door, it slammed shut. I stumbled, the darkness closing in on me. I could hear them moving behind me, the scraping noise now louder than ever. It was like they were closing in, like the walls themselves were shifting, and I was trapped in some kind of twisted nightmare. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but no one came. The figures were almost upon me now, their cold, hollow eyes staring into mine, their twisted smiles growing wider and wider. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went silent. I woke up outside, standing by my car. The gas tank was full, the engine running. It was like nothing had happened. Like the last few minutes, the shadows, the figures, everything was just a bad dream. But it wasn't. I know it wasn't. As I got in my car and drove away, I looked back at the station in my rearview mirror. The lights were flickering, and I could swear I saw the figure standing by the door again. And I knew, no matter how hard I tried to deny it, that I wasn't the first one they'd waited for, and I wouldn't be the last.
Next story.
I'll never forget the first time I worked the late shift at the gas station. It was one of those jobs you take just to pay the bills. No ambition or excitement attached. Just a place to show up, swipe cards, ring up fuel, and go home. The gas station was in a small town, tucked away off the main highway. It didn't get much traffic at night except for the occasional trucker or a local pulling in for a late-night snack or fuel. I had been working there for a few weeks, and the place was exactly as you'd expect. old, dim, with the smell of stale coffee always hanging in the air. The station had one of those flickering lights outside that just didn't seem to go out. It was the kind of place where people would only stop when they had to, and the loneliness of it always seemed to sink in around midnight. The only sound most nights was the hum of the pumps and the rustling of the wind. But one night, everything changed. It was around 2 a.m. when a truck pulled into the lot. A big, rusty rig, the kind that had probably seen better days. The engine sputtered as it came to a stop, and I could tell right away that something wasn't right. I didn't know why, but I had an instinctive feeling that tonight wasn't going to be like the other nights. The driver got out of the truck, a man in his mid-40s. He looked worn, like he hadn't slept in days. His face was covered with a grizzled beard, his eyes dark, almost sunken. He wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans with a trucker cap that covered most of his forehead. As he walked toward the door, I noticed something odd. The man had a slight limp, and his movements were jerky, like he was trying to keep something in check. I greeted him with a tired smile as he entered, but he didn't smile back. Instead, he just nodded and walked past me toward the bathroom. His presence felt off, like there was something wrong with him, though I couldn't put my finger on it. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just another restless traveler. I was sitting behind the counter, flicking through an old magazine, when I heard a loud crash from the back. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, maybe a door slamming against the wall. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard anyone come out of the bathroom, and there wasn't anyone else in the station. I hesitated for a moment before standing up, glancing around. The only other sounds in the station were the faint hum of the pumps outside and the dull light overhead. I slowly walked toward the back, the floor creaking under my feet. As I reached the hallway that led to the bathroom, I heard a low growl. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. I stopped in my tracks. The man was there, standing in the hallway just outside the bathroom. His back was to me, and his head was tilted forward as if he was listening for something. He didn't move, not at first. I was about to call out to ask if he was okay when I saw something that made my blood freeze. His shadow, which stretched across the floor, was wrong. It wasn't just a normal shadow. It looked distorted, as if it was moving independently of the man himself. It twisted and stretched in unnatural ways, as if it were trying to escape from the light. "Sir?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned around, and when he did, I saw it. His eyes, those dark, sunken eyes, were not right. They were wide open, but they didn't blink. And his skin, it looked pale, almost gray, like it was pulled tight against his skull. His mouth was slightly open, and for a split second I thought I saw a flash of something inside it. Something sharp, jagged, not human. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I took a step back, my legs starting to tremble. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't normal. The man's face seemed to distort, like his features were stretching, flickering in and out of focus. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and raspy. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But it wasn't just his voice. It was like there were other voices mixed in with his, distant and muffled, as though they were trying to speak through him. Before I could respond, the door to the back storage room slammed open, and the man lunged forward, his arm reaching out in a blur of motion. It was too fast, too unnatural. I stumbled back in fear, barely managing to avoid his grasp. The growl I'd heard earlier grew louder, more insistent, like an animal was trapped inside him, clawing to get out. I turned and bolted for the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him behind me, dragging himself across the floor with an almost inhuman speed. My hand gripped the door handle, but before I could pull it open, I heard that low growl again, only this time it wasn't coming from the man. It was coming from outside, from the shadows that lingered just beyond the light. I dared a quick glance over my shoulder, and I saw it. A dark, shifting figure like a mass of shadows. It was moving toward me, too fast to comprehend, and in that moment, I knew whatever I was dealing with wasn't human. The figure outside was connected to the man, like some twisted part of him that couldn't exist in the daylight. It was as if the darkness itself had come to life. I managed to pull open the door and dashed outside, not daring to look back. I could hear the man, if that's what he still was, screaming, but it was a distorted, inhuman scream. I ran to my car and locked the doors, my breath coming in short gasps. For a moment, everything was still. I sat there in the car trying to process what had just happened. I was terrified, my hands shaking on the wheel, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I knew I had to, but I was too scared to drive away. My mind was racing. Was I just seeing things? Had I imagined it all? That's when I looked up. The man, if you could even call him that, was standing in front of the gas station, watching me. His eyes were still wide and unblinking, his face as pale and warped as before. And behind him, I saw the shadows again, creeping, curling around the man's form. It was like he wasn't alone. There were others with him, unseen but present. I didn't stick around to find out what he wanted. I floored the gas pedal and drove off into the night, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. When I finally reached the main highway, I glanced back one last time. There was no sign of the man, no figure in the distance. But I knew deep down that I hadn't imagined it. Whatever had been in that gas station wasn't gone. It had followed me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting.
Next story.
I was young and naive when I first started working the night shift at the gas station. I'd been at the counter for about 3 months now, getting used to the emptiness of the late hours. The place was small and run down, an old station on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and nothing else. People only stopped by when they were low on gas or needed a pack of cigarettes. I wasn't expecting much excitement, just long, quiet nights of watching the clock tick by. But that night, everything changed. It started like any other. The sound of the door's bell jingling whenever someone came in, a few cars stopping by, customers coming and going, the usual hum of the neon lights above, and the faint whirring of the air conditioning in the back. The station had an old-fashioned charm, flashing lights outside, a faded sign that almost looked like it belonged in a horror movie. Around 2:30 a.m., I saw headlights in the distance, cutting through the trees. A car was approaching the station, slow and deliberate. I didn't think much of it at first, but something about the way it moved seemed off. It wasn't speeding, but it wasn't slowing down either, like it was drifting. And as it got closer, I realized that the car was old, older than any car I'd seen in years. It looked like something from the 50s or 60s, chrome bumper, faded blue paint, rusted spots here and there. The car rolled to a stop at one of the pumps, but the driver didn't get out right away. Instead, I watched through the window as the car sat there, its engine humming quietly. I was getting a weird feeling, but it could have just been the tiredness creeping in. I grabbed the register key and made my way to the door. When I opened it, the air was thick with humidity. It felt heavier outside than inside. I walked toward the car, but the driver didn't acknowledge me. I leaned in to ask if they needed any gas, but I stopped when I saw the person inside. The driver was a man, middle-aged, with unkempt hair and a rough-looking face. His clothes were out of date, like he'd stepped out of the past. His eyes were sunken, deep shadows beneath them, and there was something about his gaze that made my skin crawl. I thought for a moment that maybe he was just exhausted. Maybe I was being paranoid. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. The man didn't respond. He just stared at me, his eyes fixed and unblinking. It was unsettling, like he was looking right through me. I asked again, my voice shaky this time. Sir?" I started to step back, but something stopped me. There was a weird noise coming from inside the car. A low, faint scraping sound like something heavy was shifting under the seat. I backed up slowly, glancing at the car's interior. It was almost completely dark inside, but I could make out a shape. Something was moving, just barely visible. I could feel my heart rate picking up, my instincts telling me to get the hell out of there. I turned to walk back to the station, but as I did, I heard the car door open behind me with a loud creak. The man had stepped out of the car, and he was standing there, watching me. I didn't look back, not at first. I kept walking toward the station, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I could feel his gaze burning into me. When I reached the door, I glanced back, and that's when I saw it. The man wasn't alone. There was a shape next to him. A tall, shadowy figure that looked like a person, but wasn't quite. It had no face, just an empty space where one should be. Its arms were unnaturally long, and it swayed slightly like it was struggling to stay upright. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but the air around it felt colder, like it was sucking the warmth from the air. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I rushed inside and locked the door behind me, my hands trembling as I leaned against the counter, trying to steady my breathing. The station was eerily quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had changed. That man, that thing he was with, they weren't normal. They didn't belong. Minutes passed. I kept glancing at the door, waiting for it to jingle, for someone to come in, but nothing happened. The minutes stretched into hours. The clock ticked by slowly, each second feeling like an eternity. I couldn't stop looking at the door, as if I was waiting for it to open again. Around 4 a.m., a car pulled into the lot, and I flinched at the sound of the tires crunching on the gravel. This time, though, it wasn't the same car. It was a newer model, a normal sedan. A woman stepped out, smiling and walking toward the door. "Are you open?" she asked as she approached. I nodded, not sure if I could even speak. My throat was dry, my mind racing. I didn't know what to say, but I tried to act normal. Yeah, just a second," I stammered, still glancing toward the window. My mind was reeling from what I'd just seen. I knew it wasn't a figment of my imagination, but what the hell had happened? As I walked toward the door to unlock it for her, I saw something strange in the reflection on the glass. In the distance, past the gas pumps, I saw the man again. He was standing there watching, but this time he wasn't alone. The shadowy figure beside him was gone. It wasn't there anymore, but the man's eyes, those hollow eyes, were fixed on me with a look that made my heart stop. I quickly unlocked the door and stepped outside, trying to act like nothing was wrong. I kept my gaze forward, not daring to look at the corner where the man stood. I didn't say anything to the woman, just kept walking toward the pumps. I didn't see the man again that night, but the next morning, when I went out to clean up, I noticed something strange. The rusted blue car was gone, but there were footprints in the gravel, leading toward the trees. They were wide and uneven, like something heavy had walked through them. I asked around about the station after that, trying to find out if anyone else had seen something strange, but no one had. The locals acted like I was crazy. They all said the station had been abandoned for years. No one worked there anymore, they said, and no one ever really went near it after dark. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew that whatever had been there, whatever had visited me that night, it wasn't human. It wasn't a man. It wasn't even something from this world. And now, every time I pass that gas station on my way home, I can't help but look at the trees. Something tells me that whatever I encountered that night is still out there, waiting.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a quick stop, just a few minutes, get some gas, maybe a snack, and I'd be on my way. That's what I told myself. I had been driving for hours and the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me. I was tired, but I had to push on. I just wanted to get home. The gas station I stopped at was small, tucked away off the main highway. It wasn't a big chain or anything, just a lonely outpost in the middle of nowhere. There was only one pump working, and it looked old, rusted metal, cracked glass over the price display. The convenience store was dimly lit, but I could make out a few rows of snacks and drinks through the windows. When I pulled up, the place seemed deserted, but I didn't think much of it. It was late, after all. I stepped out of my car, hearing the crunch of gravel under my boots as I made my way to the pump. The wind was picking up, the air cold against my skin, and the only noise was the soft hum of the gas station's lights buzzing above me. I filled the tank and went inside the convenience store. The door creaked as I entered, and I heard the faint jingle of a bell above me. The store was small, with shelves packed tightly together. A few bags of chips, candy bars, and cheap sodas. Nothing special. I went to grab a bottle of water and something to eat, and that's when I noticed it. There was a man standing behind the counter, staring at me. He looked out of place. His clothes were out of date, old-fashioned, like something from the 60s or 70s. His hair was slicked back, and his face was pale. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me. His eyes didn't blink, and his expression was strange. It was unsettling, like he knew something I didn't. Can I help you? He finally asked, his voice flat, almost robotic. I nodded, trying to shake off the unease I felt. Just these, I said, setting the water and snacks on the counter. I didn't want to be rude, but I couldn't stop staring at him. There was something about him, something off, but I couldn't place it. He didn't move to ring me up right away. Instead, he just stared at the items. I cleared my throat, waiting for him to take them. When he finally did, his hands were cold, too cold for someone standing inside a warm building. I'm just passing through, I said, trying to make small talk. Not many places open around here this late. He didn't respond immediately, and when he did, his voice was lower, almost a whisper. No one ever really leaves. I froze. The words hit me like a slap. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean by that? I asked, feeling a lump form in my throat. He didn't look up as he rang up my items, but his voice was still eerily calm. People stop. They think they're just passing through, but they never leave. I tried to laugh it off, but it came out nervous. Sounds like the start of a bad horror movie, huh? He finally looked up at me then, and his eyes, they were hollow, empty, as if he wasn't seeing me, but seeing something far beyond me. The smile that spread across his face was thin, unnatural. Maybe it is, he said, his voice dropped even lower, but it's not a movie. A chill ran down my spine, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I paid for the items quickly, my hands trembling. I grabbed the bag and turned to leave, but before I could get to the door, I heard him again. Don't stay too long, he said, his voice now barely audible. I didn't turn around. I rushed out the door and back to my car, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind had picked up outside, and the lights of the gas station flickered erratically. The place felt wrong, like it was caught between worlds. I started my car and pulled out of the lot, trying to forget about the strange man behind the counter. But as I drove down the dark road, I couldn't stop looking in my rearview mirror. I kept expecting to see something behind me, something following me, but nothing was there, just the empty stretch of highway and the faint glow of the gas station fading into the distance. For the next few miles, I told myself it was nothing, just some strange person. Maybe he was a little eccentric, but that didn't mean anything. I had to stop psyching myself out, but the feeling lingered. Something was off. The air felt thicker, like I was being watched. After a while, I noticed something strange. A sign on the side of the road that I hadn't seen before. It was old, weathered, with the words "rest stop" in faded letters. I hadn't seen any other signs for rest stops for miles. But this one was here, right along the side of the road, beckoning me. I had to pull over. My mind screamed at me to keep driving, but my body betrayed me. I turned onto the narrow path and stopped by a small clearing. The rest stop was small, just a bench and a couple of trees. There was a wooden sign that said, "Rest here." I stepped out of the car, feeling the cold air hit my face again. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't figure out why. I walked over to the bench, but before I could sit down, I heard a voice. "It's better if you leave." I spun around, heart racing, but no one was there. The voice came again, this time clearer, like it was right next to me. "It's better if you leave now." I ran back to my car, slammed the door shut, and drove off as fast as I could. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and my mind was in a panic. What the hell was going on? That man, the rest stop? It was like I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, expecting to see the gas station behind me, but it wasn't there. The highway was empty, just endless road stretching out in front of me. I kept driving, eyes flicking to the mirror every few seconds, but the road was still empty. When I finally reached the next town, I stopped at a diner, hoping to get some answers. The waitress was friendly enough, but when I asked about the gas station, she looked at me like I was crazy. "That old place?" she asked. "It's been abandoned for years." I stared at her, confused. "But I was just there, not more than an hour ago." She just shook her head. "That place closed down a long time ago. People say it's haunted." I laughed nervously, thinking she was joking. But when I looked into her eyes, I saw something else there. Fear. "I don't know what you saw," she said softly, "but you're lucky you made it out." I didn't stay much longer. I paid my bill and left, feeling like the world around me had shifted. There were no explanations, no logic. Just a gas station that shouldn't have been there, and the man behind the counter who was more than just a man.
Next story.
I had never believed in ghosts, but after what happened at that gas station, I'm not so sure anymore. Let me explain. It was late, way past midnight, and I was driving through a stretch of rural highway heading back from a trip to visit family. I was exhausted, but I had to keep going. There wasn't much around this part of the highway, just trees and open fields. So when I saw the gas station up ahead, I was relieved. I could refuel, grab a drink, and get back on the road. The station was old, but it wasn't falling apart. It wasn't the kind of place you'd see on the interstate. It had that old, rundown charm. The neon sign was flickering, and the pumps looked like they hadn't been updated in decades. The convenience store attached to it had an old-fashioned feel, with bright fluorescent lights spilling out into the dark. I pulled up to one of the pumps, and as I stepped out of the car, I noticed something strange. The wind had died down completely, and everything was eerily still. The night was quiet, too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. I got to the pump and began filling up when I saw someone inside the store. At first, I thought it was the cashier, but then I realized they weren't moving. The figure was standing still, staring out the window at me. I couldn't make out any details. They were just a silhouette in the dim light. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe they were just waiting for the next customer. But as I kept pumping gas, I noticed something else. The longer I looked at the store, the more I felt like the figure was not right. The shape didn't look quite human. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its limbs seemed stretched. It was as if it was standing there, not out of curiosity, but as if it was waiting for something, waiting for me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. I finished filling up and decided to head inside for a drink. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and the cold air hit me, sending a shiver down my spine. The store was empty. There were shelves stacked with snacks, drinks, and some old magazines, but no sign of a cashier. The place felt abandoned, but it didn't look like it was. The lights were on, the aisles were stocked, but there was no one around. "Hello?" I called out, hoping to get someone's attention. No response. I walked further into the store, past the aisles, and toward the counter. The register was empty, and the door to the back office was slightly ajar. But as I stood there, I felt something cold in the air. It wasn't the temperature, it was something else, a strange, oppressive presence. That's when I saw it. Behind the counter, in the reflection of the glass display, there was a figure. I could see its face now, pale, gaunt, with dark eyes that seemed to absorb the light. It had no expression, but it was staring right at me, its gaze cold and unblinking. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but when I looked, there was no one there, just the empty store. And that same sense of wrongness hanging in the air like a storm cloud. My legs felt like lead, but I couldn't leave without making sure there wasn't someone here, someone who could explain what was going on. I checked the back office. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, but there was nothing there. No one. Just boxes of old stock, gathering dust. I was starting to panic. My mind was racing with thoughts of what was happening. Maybe it was just an old building, full of creaky noises. Maybe I was imagining things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I turned back toward the counter and stopped dead in my tracks. There was a person standing behind it now, the same figure from before. It had appeared without a sound, but this time I could see it clearly. It was tall, way too tall. And it was smiling. The smile was too wide, stretching across its face in an unnatural way. Its teeth were sharp, jagged, and its eyes were dark, empty holes. I couldn't move. My entire body was frozen like I was stuck in place. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. It was just there, watching me with those empty eyes. I don't know how much time passed, seconds, minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The longer I stood there, the more I felt like I was suffocating. Like the walls of the store were closing in on me. I had to get out. I had to run. I spun around and bolted toward the door, but as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut on its own. I tried again, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. The lights above me flickered, and for a split second, everything went dark. The buzzing of the lights overhead seemed to echo in the silence. Then I heard a voice. It wasn't the figure's voice. It was something deeper, more guttural, like it was coming from the walls themselves. The voice whispered my name, soft at first, but then louder, more demanding. Leave. Now. I couldn't breathe. I was choking on fear. I turned back to the counter and the figure was gone. But there was something new. On the counter, in the spot where it had been standing, was a small, dusty journal. Its pages were yellowed and worn, as if it had been there for years. Against every instinct telling me to get out, I reached for it. I opened the cover, and the first thing I saw was a name written in faded ink. Jared Greer. I flipped through the pages, and what I found made my blood run cold. The journal detailed strange events, people who had stopped at the station, people who never left. It was like a collection of stories about all the disappearances that had happened over the years, but the entries were all too similar, and they all ended the same way. The person would see something strange, something dark, and then they'd be gone, never seen again. And at the very last page, there was a single line written in red ink: "You are next." I dropped the journal in shock, and that's when I heard the bell above the door jingling again. I didn't look. I didn't need to. I ran out of the store as fast as I could, barely registering the cold wind hitting my face. I threw open the door to my car, got in, and sped away without looking back. But even now, as I tell you this story, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me. It's like I'm marked now, like the gas station knows who I am. And every now and then, when I drive down the highway at night, I see the lights in the distance, flickering. I don't stop anymore.
Next story.
I've never been the type to believe in ghost stories. I mean, I always thought they were just that, stories. But something happened one summer that completely changed my perspective. It all started during a long road trip. I was on my way back home after visiting some old friends, driving through the heart of the Midwest, cutting across miles of desolate highway. It was around 1 a.m. when I started running low on gas. My phone had no signal, and I hadn't seen a gas station in at least 50 miles. I was tired, frustrated, and just wanted to get to the next town. After driving for what felt like forever, I finally spotted a dim light in the distance. It was a small gas station off the side of the road, looking pretty outdated, but it was a sign of hope. I pulled in without thinking twice. The station had an eerie quietness to it. The flickering lights above the pumps cast strange shadows on the pavement. I could tell right away it wasn't a well-kept place. The gas station had an ancient feel, almost like it hadn't been updated in decades. The walls were cracked, the paint chipped, and the windows had that grimy layer of dust that suggested no one had bothered to clean in years. There wasn't a soul around, but the pump was operational, so I figured I'd get in, fill up, and get out. I pulled my car to the nearest pump and began filling up. That's when I noticed something odd. The store, which was visible from where I stood, had a single light on, shining faintly through the glass. The door was cracked open a little, but there was no movement inside. I had the feeling I wasn't alone, even though no one appeared to be there. Just as I was finishing with the pump, I heard the sound of footsteps coming from the store. I turned to see an old man slowly walking toward me. He was hunched over, using a cane to support himself. His clothes were worn, and his face was weathered, deeply lined with age. He had gray hair, and his eyes, though tired, held a strange glint, a look of someone who'd seen too much in their lifetime. "Need any help?" he asked in a raspy voice. I was a little startled, not expecting anyone to show up out here. No thanks, I'm good," I said, trying to hide the unease in my voice. The man just nodded slowly, as if he didn't really hear me. He looked around as though he was lost in thought, and then his gaze settled on me. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his tone suddenly turning more serious. I didn't know what to make of his question. "No, just passing through." He nodded again, but this time there was something unsettling about the way he did it. The air around us seemed to get colder, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He took a few steps closer, his cane tapping softly against the pavement, then stopped just a few feet away from me. "That's the thing about this place," he said softly. "You always think you can just pass through, but not everyone gets to leave." His words sent a chill through my entire body. I forced a nervous laugh. "What are you talking about?" The old man didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked up at the gas station, as if waiting for something. I followed his gaze, but I didn't see anything unusual, just the empty station, the shadows stretching across the lot. He finally turned back to me, his face pale under the light. "You'd better get back on the road, son," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't want to be here when the others arrive." The way he said it sent a wave of dread through me. I couldn't explain why, but I suddenly felt like I had to leave, fast. Fast. I didn't ask any more questions. I just nodded, threw the nozzle back in place, and quickly got into my car. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror to see the old man standing in the same spot, watching me drive off. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't until the next morning that I found out just how wrong things had been. I stopped at a diner in the next town over to grab some breakfast, still trying to shake off the unease from the gas station. I struck up a conversation with the waitress, and without even thinking about it, I asked her about the gas station I had stopped at the night before. Her expression changed the moment I mentioned it. She grew quiet, and I could see her eyes flicker with an emotion I couldn't place. Fear, maybe. "That station?" she asked, her voice low. "You don't want to go near it. People say it's haunted." I laughed, assuming she was just telling a local ghost story to entertain herself. "Haunted?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She glanced around as if making sure no one else could hear us. Then, in a whisper, she told me the story of the old man. His name was Henry, and he had run the station for decades. But one night, years ago, something happened. Some say he was involved in a terrible accident on the road. Others say it was something far worse, something supernatural. Either way, Henry had never been seen again after that night. "Only his ghost lingers there now," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He's the one who warns people. He's the one who tells them not to stay. But no one ever listens, and the ones who do, they're the lucky ones." I stared at her, not knowing what to say. I thought it was just another local legend, but something in the back of my mind told me to listen. I couldn't stop thinking about the way Henry had looked at me, the eerie way he spoke. Something about that gas station, that place, felt wrong. When I left the diner, I took the long way around, deliberately avoiding the highway that led me back to that gas station. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something far worse than I could have imagined. Years have passed since that night, but I still think about it every time I drive at night. I don't stop at small, remote gas stations anymore. If I'm running low on fuel and I see one of those lonely, flickering lights in the distance, I turn around and keep driving. The memory of the old man's words still haunts me. Not everyone gets to leave.
Next story.
It was one of those nights when you just feel like something's off. You know the kind where the air feels heavier than usual and every little sound seems amplified. I was on my way back home after a long day at work. I had been driving for what felt like hours through some back roads when I saw it. A gas station up ahead, glowing like a beacon in the darkness. I didn't need gas, but I figured it would be a good spot to stretch my legs and grab a snack. It wasn't part of a chain or anything fancy, just a small, family-owned station, the kind that had seen better days. The neon sign above the pumps buzzed every time it flickered, and the convenience store was dimly lit with just a few cars parked outside. I pulled in and parked by the nearest pump. There were no other customers in sight, just the low hum of the lights and the occasional flutter of wind. As I got out of the car, I felt something. It wasn't obvious, just a subtle shiver down my spine, but it was there. I shook it off, reminding myself I was just being paranoid. I was tired, that's all. I started filling up, the sound of the gas flowing into my car mingling with the quiet night air. That's when I noticed the door to the convenience store slowly creaking open. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it was moving too slowly, like someone was trying to be subtle about it. I looked up, and standing in the doorway was a man. He was tall, too tall. He wore a dark jacket and a cap, but his face was in shadow. I couldn't see his features clearly, but there was something about the way he stood there, motionless, that made me uneasy. His eyes weren't visible, just darkness under the brim of his cap. I wasn't sure why, but I immediately felt like I needed to get inside, get away from him. I finished pumping the gas quickly and made my way toward the store, trying to act normal, but the feeling only intensified as I got closer. I could hear the faint sound of my shoes hitting the pavement, the silence of the night pressing in around me. When I stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled and a cold rush of air greeted me. It was warmer inside, but not by much. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the small aisles. I could feel the place wasn't right. The shelves were filled with dusty, outdated items: chips, sodas, newspapers from weeks ago. The man was inside now, standing by the counter. He hadn't said anything yet, just watching me. I didn't want to make eye contact, but I couldn't help it. His eyes, when I finally caught a glimpse, were completely black. Like there were no whites, just endless voids. I froze for a moment, but then I forced myself to look away, trying to ignore the creeping dread building in my chest. I went to the back of the store, grabbing a bottle of water and some gum, anything to keep my mind occupied. But the whole time, I could feel his presence behind me, his gaze following me like a weight I couldn't shake off. I tried to ignore it. I really did. Finally, I walked up to the counter, ready to pay and get out of there. The man was still standing there, unmoving, his hands resting on the counter. He didn't say a word as I placed the items down. I tried to act casual, but there was a knot in my stomach now. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I glanced at the register. It was an old model, one of those with the big buttons that looked like they hadn't been used in years. As I looked, I noticed something strange. Something was written on the counter, etched into the wood. "Get out." I blinked, not sure if I was seeing things. I looked at the man, but his expression didn't change. He still didn't speak. He didn't need to. I suddenly felt nauseous, like I was suffocating in the silence. I could hear the hum of the old fridge behind me, the faint drip of a leaky faucet somewhere in the back, but it all sounded so distant, like I was trapped in a dream. I reached for my wallet, but before I could even take a step, the man spoke. "You shouldn't stay here," he said, his voice low and gravelly, like it was being dragged from the depths of some ancient place. I froze. "I've seen you before," he continued, his voice growing darker. "You don't remember, do you?" I felt my heart skip a beat. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. I don't know what you're talking about," I said, though my voice sounded weak, uncertain. He smiled then, a slow, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You'll remember. It's only a matter of time." I couldn't take it anymore. Without saying another word, I grabbed the items and rushed out of the store, my heart pounding. I didn't dare look back. The door slammed behind me with a force that made me jump. I ran back to my car and jumped in, starting the engine as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the sweat on my palms. I looked at the gas station in the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw the man standing by the door, watching me drive away. I sped down the road, trying to push the images from my mind. The darkness felt different now, like it was closing in on me. My headlights cut through the night, illuminating the empty highway ahead, but there was something in the distance, something in the periphery of my vision that I couldn't quite make out. I didn't dare look again. I just kept driving, my foot pressing harder on the gas pedal. When I got home, I was exhausted but relieved to be safe. I got out of the car and walked inside, locking the door behind me. As I sat down on the couch, I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but it lingered. I couldn't get the man out of my mind, couldn't stop hearing his voice or the words he had said. I decided to check my phone, hoping to distract myself. I unlocked the screen, and there was a message notification from an unknown number. I opened it. "Don't go back. It's too late now." I dropped the phone in shock. I haven't gone back to that gas station. But every time I drive by that stretch of highway, I can't help but glance over, and I swear, every time I do, I see that same glow in the distance. The man's watching. And now I can't shake the feeling that he's waiting for me to return.